You missed a spot, my husband said while a room full of millionaires laughed softly over champagne, and that was the exact moment a billionaire across the ballroom looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was being held at the Blackstone Hotel in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors so polished they almost looked wet. Every woman in the ballroom wore diamonds that caught the light whenever they lifted their wine glasses, and every man carried himself like he owned at least 3 companies and half the city council. I stood near table 12 holding a silver tray of empty champagne flutes because Thomas had handed it to me 20 minutes earlier with the same dismissive smile he'd worn for most of our 42-year marriage. "Keep yourself busy, Evelyn," he had whispered before turning back toward his investors. "You know standing around makes you look awkward." At 64 years old, I had learned how to disappear without leaving the room. I wore a dark navy dress I'd bought 7 years ago for our son Ethan's graduation dinner, though Thomas still complained it made me look older than necessary. My silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of my neck, and the only jewelry I wore was my wedding ring and a thin pearl bracelet my mother had given me before she died. Around me, women laughed too loudly at stories they barely listened to while men discussed mergers, golf memberships, and vacation homes in Aspen. Nobody noticed me except when they needed another drink. Thomas liked it that way. "My wife prefers helping instead of socializing," he often told people with a polite chuckle. "Keeps her happy." The truth was, I used to love socializing. Before marriage. Before children. Before years of becoming smaller and quieter until even my own opinions sounded unfamiliar inside my head. A waiter passed beside me carrying crab cakes and miniature filet mignon sliders, and for a second I caught my reflection in one of the mirrored columns near the ballroom entrance. I looked composed. Calm. Invisible. Thomas was standing near the stage speaking with several board members from Whitmore Capital when he crooked 2 fingers toward me without even looking directly at me. The gesture felt less like calling a wife and more like summoning hotel staff. I walked over anyway. "Evelyn, wipe the table," he said quietly, nodding toward a small ring of water beneath someone's cocktail glass. "People are arriving." One of the younger executives laughed awkwardly and looked away. Another man sipped his bourbon without reacting at all. That was the thing about humiliation after a certain age. People stopped seeing it. They called it marriage. I reached for a linen napkin and bent slightly to wipe the table while Thomas continued discussing investment projections as though I were part of the furniture. "My husband always says I'd be lost without him," I heard myself say lightly, though my voice sounded far away even to me. Thomas smirked. "You would," he replied. A few people smiled politely. Then the room changed. I didn't notice it at first. The orchestra was still playing softly near the dance floor. Glasses still clinked together. Someone near the entrance laughed too loudly at an expensive joke. But suddenly the conversations around us thinned, like wind leaving a room before a storm. I looked up slowly and saw a tall older man standing only a few feet away beside the grand staircase. His silver hair was brushed neatly back, and his black tuxedo fit with the kind of effortless precision money could buy. Everyone in the ballroom knew who he was. Charles Whitaker. Founder of Whitaker International. Billionaire. Philanthropist. The kind of man whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. But Charles Whitaker wasn't looking at Thomas or the executives surrounding him. He was staring directly at me. Not casually. Not politely. He looked stunned. Like someone had opened a door to a past he thought no longer existed. My fingers tightened around the napkin. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Charles took one slow step closer, his expression softening into something I couldn't quite recognize. Shock. Grief. Maybe even regret. "Evelyn," he whispered quietly enough that only the people nearest us could hear. His voice cracked slightly on my name. "God, is that really you?" Beside me, Thomas gave a confused laugh. You know my wife, he asked, sounding amused by the idea. But Charles never looked away from me. Not once. And for the first time in decades, I felt like someone actually saw my face. Thomas laughed first. It was the short, dismissive kind of laugh he used whenever something made him uncomfortable, but he still wanted to appear in control. Well, he said, adjusting the cuff of his tuxedo, I suppose Evelyn has more of a social history than I realized. A few people near him smiled politely, though nobody seemed entirely sure how to react. Charles Whittaker still had not taken his eyes off me. It unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I had spent so many years being overlooked that direct attention now felt almost invasive, like sunlight hitting a room that had stayed closed for decades. It has been a very long time, Charles said quietly. His voice was calmer now, but something beneath it still sounded shaken. 40 years, I think. I swallowed carefully. Something like that. Thomas looked between us with sudden curiosity. You two knew each other back in college? Before I could answer, Charles gave a faint smile. Your wife was impossible to forget. The room went strangely still again. I noticed Amanda across the ballroom lowering her champagne glass halfway to her lips while Ethan frowned in confusion beside her. My son had never heard another man speak about me with admiration before. Neither had I. Thomas slipped one hand casually into his pocket, but I recognized the tension behind the gesture immediately. My husband hated uncertainty. He hated conversations he could not dominate even more. Evelyn never talks much about the past, he said lightly. She was too busy raising our family while I built my company. Charles nodded once, though his expression did not change. That is interesting, he replied. Because when I knew Evelyn, she was the most ambitious person in the room. I felt heat rise quietly into my face. Not embarrassment. Something stranger. Recognition. The orchestra continued playing in the background while servers moved between tables carrying tiny desserts. Arranged like artwork on silver trays, but suddenly I could hear memories more clearly than the music. A practice room at Northwestern University. Sheet music spread across an old piano. Snow falling outside tall windows while a younger version of myself argued passionately about composing instead of teaching. I had not thought about those years in a very long time. Thomas chuckled again, though the sound came out thinner this time. Well, people grow up. Charles looked at him then. Really looked at him. Sometimes, he said carefully. Sometimes they simply disappear. Nobody spoke after that. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before another couple approached Charles asking about a museum donation. He excused himself politely, but before walking away, he looked back at me one more time. I would very much like to speak with you later tonight, Evelyn. Then he disappeared into the crowd of executives and politicians surrounding him. Thomas waited exactly 3 seconds before turning toward me. What was that supposed to mean? He asked under his breath, his smile frozen for appearances. I do not know. You dated him? No, that part was true. Charles and I had never technically dated. Back then we had been too busy studying, dreaming, planning futures that felt enormous and terrifying. But there had been something between us. Something unfinished. Thomas exhaled sharply through his nose. You could have mentioned you knew Charles Whittaker. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. Over 42 years of marriage, Thomas had never once asked who I used to know. Or who I used to be. It never seemed important, I answered softly. Thomas stared at me for another moment before his attention drifted immediately back toward the investors near the stage. Business always came first. Even now. Well, he muttered, straightening his jacket, try not to say anything strange if he talks to you again. People like Whittaker remember everything. Then he walked away without waiting for a response. I stood alone near the ballroom wall, still holding the folded linen napkin in my hand. Across the room, I watched Charles greeting. senators, CEOs, and television reporters with effortless confidence. But twice more during the next 20 minutes, his eyes found mine through the crowd. And each time they did, I felt something inside me shift slightly out of place. By the end of the evening, I realized I could not remember the last time anyone had looked at me with curiosity instead of obligation. When the gala finally ended around 11:30, Chicago rain had started falling outside the hotel windows in long silver streaks. Guests gathered their coats while valets pulled luxury cars beneath the entrance canopy one after another. Thomas was already irritated because one of his investors had left early without discussing a potential partnership. Honestly, he complained while adjusting his overcoat, people at these charity events pretend they care about philanthropy, but it is all networking. I nodded absently, though I barely heard him. Because just as we approached the revolving doors, a familiar voice behind me said quietly, "Evelyn, wait." I turned slowly. Charles Whitaker stood only a few feet away holding a black umbrella in one hand. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind him while the hotel lights reflected gold across the marble lobby floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Charles smiled sadly and said the one sentence I never expected to hear again. "I still have your music." The rain outside the Blackstone Hotel came down harder by the time Thomas and I stepped beneath the entrance canopy. Drivers rushed to open car doors while guests hurried across the wet sidewalk in designer heels and polished leather shoes. Chicago at night always looked beautiful in the rain. The city lights blurred against the glass towers like melted gold. But I barely noticed any of it because Charles Whitaker was standing directly in front of me holding a black umbrella and looking at me like 40 years had collapsed into a single breath. "I still have your music," he repeated softly. Thomas gave a short laugh beside me, though this one sounded forced. "Evelyn wrote music?" he asked. I looked at him quietly. "A long time ago." "She was extraordinary," Charles answered before I could say anything else. "There was a composition professor at Northwestern who once told me she could have written for film orchestras or concert halls if she wanted." Thomas blinked twice. The expression on his face almost would have been funny if it had not hurt so much. My husband had spent more than 4 decades beside me, yet another man seemed to know entire pieces of my life that Thomas had never even noticed were missing. A valet pulled our car toward the curb while rainwater streamed down the windshield in silver ribbons. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, that is certainly surprising." Charles ignored him completely. "Do you still play?" he asked me. I shook my head once. "Not anymore." Something shifted in his expression then. Not pity. Something heavier. Like hearing about a beautiful building that had quietly burned down years ago while nobody tried to save it. "That is a loss," he said. Thomas checked his watch impatiently. "We should probably get going." But before I could step toward the car, Charles reached inside his coat pocket and handed me a simple white business card. No gold lettering. No flashy logo. Just his name and a private number written beneath it. "Please call me," he said. "There are things I think you deserve to know." Thomas immediately stiffened beside me. "About what exactly?" Charles finally looked at him fully, and for the first time that evening I saw something cold settle behind his polite smile. "About who your wife used to be." The valet opened our car door at exactly the wrong moment because the silence that followed felt so sharp even he glanced between us nervously before stepping back. Thomas forced a tight smile. "I think I know my wife pretty well." Charles held his gaze calmly. "I do not think you know her at all." Then he stepped back into the rain without another word. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes because traffic leaving downtown was terrible after the gala. Thomas barely spoke during the first 20 minutes except to complain about parking costs and one investor who had ignored his follow-up emails. But I could feel the tension building beside me like pressure inside a sealed room. Finally, as we stopped at a red light near Michigan Avenue, he glanced toward me sharply. Why have I never heard about any of this? I stared out the passenger window watching rain slide across the glass. You never asked. He scoffed quietly. That is not fair. I almost turned toward him then. Almost asked how many times during our marriage he had sat down and genuinely asked me what I wanted, what I missed, or what I had given up. But exhaustion settled over me instead. The kind that builds slowly over decades. Maybe not, I said softly. Thomas tightened both hands around the steering wheel. I just do not understand why Whitaker was acting like you were some kind of lost genius. Lost genius. The words sounded absurd and painful at the same time. We passed the dark shoreline of Lake Michigan while memories kept surfacing without permission. Practice rooms that smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. My fingers flying across piano keys at 2 in the morning before finals. Charles sitting quietly beside a grand piano listening to me play as if the music actually mattered. I had not remembered those details in years. By the time we reached our house in North Shore, the rain had slowed into a light mist. The house itself looked exactly like the life Thomas had always wanted. Large. Impressive. Perfectly maintained. Every window glowing warm against the darkness. But stepping inside felt strangely hollow after tonight. Thomas loosened his tie while I placed my small evening bag carefully on the hallway table. You know, he said suddenly, if Whitaker takes an interest in us socially, it could be useful for Ethan's future at the firm. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Even now. Not curiosity about my past. Not concern about what I felt standing in that ballroom tonight. Just opportunity. I turned toward the staircase slowly. I am tired, Thomas. Do not be sensitive, he replied automatically. I am just being realistic. I nodded once because arguing no longer seemed worth the effort. Upstairs, I changed out of my navy dress and carefully removed my pearl bracelet before sitting alone at the edge of the bed. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the dishwasher downstairs. On the nightstand beside me sat an old cedar jewelry box I had not opened in years. Slowly, almost without thinking, I lifted the lid. Inside, beneath old receipts and faded photographs, rested a single yellowed sheet of music folded carefully in half. My composition from senior year. The one I thought had disappeared forever. My fingers trembled slightly as I stared at the notes written in younger handwriting. Then I realized something that made my chest tighten. Charles had not just remembered my name tonight. He had remembered the woman I used to be before I disappeared into someone else's life. I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending and walked downstairs wrapped in an old cream-colored cardigan I had owned since Ethan was in high school. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking with slow mechanical patience. Thomas had fallen asleep almost immediately upstairs, one arm stretched across my side of the bed as if occupying space mattered more than noticing my absence. I made myself tea in the dark kitchen and stood by the window overlooking our backyard. The garden lights cast pale circles across the wet grass while rainwater still clung to the patio furniture outside. For years I had loved this house because I believed it represented stability, success, family. But standing there alone in the middle of the night, I realized something painful. I had spent most of my life maintaining a home that never truly belonged to me emotionally. Thomas always called it our house, yet every important decision inside it had carried only his voice. The kitchen renovation happened because he wanted something more modern for entertaining clients. The Steinway piano I once dreamed of buying disappeared from our budget discussions because Ethan needed private school tuition and Thomas was investing aggressively during the late 1990s. Even the pale gray walls surrounding me had been chosen by an interior designer Thomas liked because he said my taste felt too sentimental. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stared at my reflection in the glass. 64 years old. Silver hair. Fine lines around my eyes. A woman who had once written music until sunrise, now measuring her worth by whether dinner was served on time for corporate guests. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing the difference between compromise and erasure. The next morning arrived cold and overcast. Thomas left early for the office after mentioning twice that Charles Whittaker might become a useful connection if handled correctly. I simply nodded while placing toast onto his breakfast plate. He kissed the top of my head absently before leaving, already checking emails on his phone before the front door even closed behind him. By 10 o'clock, the house felt unbearably quiet again. I wandered upstairs and opened the cedar box once more. The old sheet music rested exactly where I left it the night before, fragile at the edges from age. Beneath it sat another forgotten item. A photograph from college. Charles and I standing outside the music building during winter, both laughing at something beyond the camera frame. I stared at the image for a long time. Back then, I wore my hair shorter. My eyes looked brighter somehow. Less careful. Charles had his arm around my shoulder in the photograph, comfortable and natural, as though neither of us questioned we would remain part of each other's lives forever. I remembered the day that picture was taken. We had skipped an economics lecture to sit in a coffee shop near campus arguing about art, politics, and whether talent mattered more than opportunity. Charles believed ambition could overcome anything. I used to believe that too. Then I met Thomas Hayes during my final year at Northwestern. He arrived confident, polished, already working internships with financial firms downtown while everyone else still worried about exams and rent money. My mother adored him immediately because he seemed stable. Responsible. A man like that can build a future, she told me once while folding laundry in our tiny apartment kitchen. Charles dreamed loudly. Thomas promised security. At 22 years old, security sounded wiser. I still remember the exact evening I told Charles the first. Was engaged. He had gone completely silent for almost a full minute before asking only one question. Is this really what you want? At the time, I thought it was. Or maybe I simply believed wanting less from life made me mature. By noon, I found myself sitting at the baby grand piano in our formal living room. Thomas bought it 15 years ago because clients considered pianos elegant in wealthy homes, though he always joked afterward that it was mostly decorative. I touched the keys gently. Dust had settled into the corners from disuse. For a moment, I hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, I played the first few measures from the composition Charles mentioned last night. My fingers stumbled almost immediately. The notes sounded weak at first, uncertain after decades of silence. But then something strange happened. Muscle memory returned little by little beneath my hands like a language buried deep inside me waiting patiently to be remembered. I played quietly for nearly 20 minutes before tears finally blurred my vision. Not dramatic tears. Not loud sobbing. Just silent grief sliding down my face for the woman I used to be. Suddenly, the sound of a car door outside startled me. I wiped my cheeks quickly as Ethan and Amanda walked through the front entrance carrying shopping bags and coffees from a cafe nearby. Mom? Ethan called. We did not know you were home. Amanda stepped into the living room first and stopped short when she saw me sitting at the piano. Oh, she said with visible surprise. I had no idea you actually played. The words landed softly. But something about them hurt more than they should have. Amanda recovered first. She set her designer handbag carefully onto the marble entry table and gave a small laugh that sounded more surprised than cruel. I honestly thought the piano was just decoration, she said while stepping farther into the room. Ethan stood behind her holding 2 paper coffee cups from a place downtown he liked because they charged $8 for espresso and spelled his name correctly every time. He looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they realize there is an entire emotional history sitting in front of them that they somehow missed. You never told me you played seriously, Mom, he said. I lowered the piano lid gently before answering. There were many things I stopped talking about. The room became quiet after that. Amanda glanced toward Ethan briefly before smoothing the sleeve of her cream-colored coat. She always looked polished, even on casual afternoons. Perfect hair. Perfect nails. Perfect smile prepared for social media photographs and charity brunches. Well, she said lightly, Dad always said you mostly focused on the family while he built the business. Mostly focused on the family. Such clean, harmless words for the slow disappearance of a person. I stood from the piano bench slowly. Your father built many things, I replied. But not alone. Ethan frowned slightly at that. Not defensive yet. Just confused. He had spent his entire life inside a version of our marriage narrated almost entirely by Thomas. In his mind, his father was disciplined and successful while I simply maintained the background of family life quietly and naturally, like wallpaper or lighting. Actually, Amanda continued while accepting a coffee from Ethan, Thomas was telling us about Charles Whitaker recognizing you at the gala. Ethan thought maybe you had gone to school together. We did. That is incredible, she said, though I could not tell whether she meant it sincerely or because the idea suddenly increased my social value in her eyes. The Whitakers practically own half of Chicago. Ethan sat down on the edge of the sofa looking thoughtful. Dad said Whitaker seemed really interested in talking to you. I walked toward the window overlooking the backyard again. Gray clouds still hung low over the trees, and a few wet leaves clung stubbornly to the stone patio outside. Charles and I were close once, I admitted quietly. Before I married your father. Ethan blinked. Close how? I smiled faintly without turning around. The kind of close people are before life chooses a different direction for them. Amanda exchanged another quick look with him. I noticed it immediately. Curiosity. Calculation. The atmosphere in the room had shifted in a way I recognized from years of attending Thomas's business dinners. The moment someone's hidden importance becomes visible, people suddenly begin re-evaluating every previous interaction. Amanda stepped closer to the piano and touched one of the keys softly with her fingertip. You really composed music? She asked. I used to. Were you good? The question should have sounded insulting. Instead it sounded honest. I considered answering modestly out of habit, but something inside me felt too tired for shrinking anymore. Yes, I said simply. Amanda looked genuinely startled by the confidence in my voice. Before anyone could speak again, my phone rang on the kitchen counter. I almost ignored it until I noticed the unfamiliar private number on the screen. The moment I answered, I recognized Charles's voice immediately. Calm. Deep. Familiar in a way that unsettled me. I hope I am not interrupting, he said. No good. Because I have been thinking about our conversation all night. Ethan straightened slightly on the sofa while Amanda pretended not to listen. There was not much of a conversation, I replied softly. Charles gave a quiet laugh. Perhaps not. But there should have been. I leaned one hand against the kitchen counter. Why now, Charles? Silence lingered briefly on the line before he answered. Because I spent 40 years believing you chose a life that made you happy. Last night was the first time I realized I may have been wrong. Something tightened painfully in my chest. Ethan lowered his coffee cup slowly, watching my expression with growing confusion. I found something recently, Charles continued. Something connected to your work at Northwestern. I think you deserve to see it. My work? Meet me for lunch tomorrow. 1 o'clock. The Whitaker Conservatory downtown. I closed my eyes briefly. The Whitaker Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music institutions in Illinois. Thomas donated money there every Christmas without realizing my compositions were probably still archived somewhere inside its walls. I do not know if that is a good idea, I whispered. Evelyn, Charles said gently, You spent your entire life making yourself smaller for other people. At least, allow someone to remind you who you were before that happened. Tears threatened suddenly and unexpectedly, but I forced them back. Across the room, Ethan was staring at me like he had never seen me clearly before. "All right," I said quietly. "I will come." After the call ended, the house felt strangely still. Amanda broke the silence first. "You are having lunch with Charles Whittaker?" she asked carefully. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes." Ethan stood slowly from the sofa. "Mom," he said, almost uncertainly, "how much do we actually not know about you?" I looked toward the closed piano again. Toward the dust that had settled over decades of silence. Then I answered with more honesty than I had allowed myself in years. "More than you think." The next morning felt strangely unfamiliar from the moment I woke up. Not because anything dramatic had changed inside the house, but because for the first time in years, I had plans that belonged only to me. Thomas had already left for work before 7:30 after reminding me twice to mention Ethan's name if Charles brought up internships or future business opportunities. "Connections matter," he said while knotting his tie in front of the hallway mirror. "Especially with men like Whittaker." I simply nodded while pouring coffee into his travel mug. He kissed my cheek automatically before leaving, the same way someone taps a light switch out of habit. By 11:30, I stood upstairs in front of my closet feeling unexpectedly nervous. Most of my clothes existed for practical purposes now. Charity dinners. Family holidays. Country club lunches where women complimented each other's handbags while quietly ranking one another's worth. My fingers paused on a soft blue cashmere sweater I had not worn in years because Thomas once said the color made me look sentimental. I put it on anyway. The Whittaker Conservatory stood near Millennium Park inside a restored limestone building with tall arched windows and bronze doors polished bright from decades of use. Students carrying violin cases and sheet music moved through the entrance with the kind of focused energy I remembered from another lifetime. 4. A moment, standing on the sidewalk outside, I almost turned around and went home. Then I heard piano music drifting faintly through the building, and my feet carried me forward before fear could stop me. Charles was waiting in a private lounge overlooking one of the rehearsal halls downstairs. Sunlight streamed through massive windows behind him, turning the silver in his hair almost white. He stood when he saw me approach, and something in his expression softened immediately. "You came," he said quietly. "I almost did not." "I am glad you did." Lunch had already been arranged on a small table near the windows. Nothing extravagant. Soup. Fresh bread. Tea. Somehow the simplicity of it calmed me more than any luxury restaurant could have. "You look exactly the same when you are nervous," Charles said with a faint smile as we sat down. I laughed softly despite myself. "At 64? "Yes." His gaze lingered on me gently. "You still tuck one hand beneath your sleeve when you feel uncertain." I looked down automatically and realized he was right. The gesture embarrassed me more than it should have because it meant he remembered details about me no one else ever noticed. For several minutes we talked carefully about ordinary things. Chicago traffic. Ethan's work at Thomas's firm. The conservatory renovations Charles recently funded. But underneath the conversation sat 40 years of unfinished history neither of us quite knew how to approach. Finally, Charles reached into a leather folder beside him and slid a thin stack of papers across the table. "I found these 6 months ago while digitizing old archives from Northwestern," he said quietly. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder. Inside were copies of my original compositions from senior year. Not just one piece. All of them. Carefully preserved. Carefully labeled. My breath caught painfully in my chest. I thought these were gone. They almost were. Charles leaned back slightly. One of your professors submitted them anonymously to a national young composers competition during our final year. I looked up sharply. What? You won, Evelyn? The room around me seemed to tilt. No, I whispered. Automatically. I would have known. Charles held my gaze steadily. You should have. My fingers tightened against the edge of the papers. What happened? He hesitated long enough for dread to begin spreading quietly through my stomach. Thomas happened. For several seconds I could not speak at all. Downstairs, somewhere beyond the glass rehearsal hall, a student practiced scales on a piano. The notes floated upward faintly through the building. I do not understand, I finally whispered. Charles exhaled slowly. Your acceptance letter arrived the same week you got engaged. Full scholarship. New York apprenticeship. Everything. I stared at him blankly. No, I was there when your professor tried calling your apartment repeatedly because you never responded. My chest tightened so sharply it almost hurt to breathe. I never received anything. Charles nodded once, sadness settling visibly across his face. I know. Silence wrapped around us heavily after that. I thought about the tiny apartment Thomas and I rented during our first year of marriage. The stack of unopened mail he always sorted himself because he claimed bills stressed me out unnecessarily. The way he insisted New York was unrealistic. Selfish. Temporary. You are imagining things, he used to say whenever I spoke too long about music. Real life matters more. My eyes blurred suddenly. Not loud crying. Just the quiet collapse of something I had unknowingly grieved for decades without understanding why. Charles spoke carefully now, each word deliberate. I did not tell you this to hurt you. I stared down at my younger handwriting covering the pages before me. Notes. Melodies. Entire pieces of myself I thought had vanished. Then why tell me now? Charles was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because last night I watched your husband speak to you like you were invisible. He paused. And I realized he had been erasing you for almost your entire life. I drove home from the conservatory in complete silence. Chicago traffic moved slowly around me while gray clouds hung low above the city skyline, but I barely noticed any of it. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire drive because if I loosened them even slightly, I felt like something inside me might completely fall apart. A full scholarship. New York. An apprenticeship. An entire future that had existed only a few feet away from me before quietly disappearing into someone else's decision. I replayed memories over and over searching for signs I missed. The unopened envelopes Thomas always handled himself during our first year of marriage. The way he discouraged me from calling professors after graduation because he said real adults stop chasing unrealistic dreams. The arguments whenever I spent too much time at the piano. At 22 years old, I thought sacrifice was proof of love. Now, sitting in traffic beside Lakeshore Drive at 64, I finally understood something devastating. Sacrifice only means something when both people are giving things up equally. By the time I reached North Shore, the house felt colder than usual despite the heat running inside. Thomas was already home unexpectedly early, sitting in his office with spreadsheets open across his desk and financial news playing softly on the television mounted behind him. He looked up immediately when I entered the room. How was lunch with Whitaker? His tone sounded casual, but I recognized the tension underneath it. I placed my purse quietly onto the leather chair near the doorway. Interesting. Thomas leaned back slightly. Interesting good or interesting bad? I studied him carefully for the first time in years. Really studied him. The expensive watch. The tailored shirt. The confidence built from decades of people listening whenever he spoke. This man had shaped the entire architecture of our life together. And suddenly I could see the invisible pieces too. The insecurity beneath the charm. The need for control hidden inside practicality. Charles showed me something today, I said quietly. Thomas smiled faintly without concern. Hopefully business-related. No, his expression changed almost immediately. Small. Subtle. But enough. What do you mean? I took a slow breath. I was accepted into a music apprenticeship in New York after college. Silence. Thomas stared at me for 2 full seconds. Before giving a short dismissive laugh. Evelyn, that was 40 years ago. I never received the acceptance letter. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. So? Charles says my professors tried contacting me repeatedly. Thomas stood up then, moving toward the liquor cabinet near the window. I honestly do not understand why this matters now. I watched him pour bourbon into a crystal glass with perfectly steady hands. Did you know about it? He did not answer immediately, which told me everything before he finally spoke. You were engaged to me already. My chest tightened painfully. That is not what I asked. Thomas exhaled sharply. Fine. Yes. I knew about it. The room went completely silent after that. Somewhere upstairs, the dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. Outside, wind moved through the trees lining our street. Ordinary sounds inside an ordinary afternoon while my entire marriage quietly rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. You hid it from me, I whispered. Thomas turned toward me with visible irritation now, as though my reaction itself was becoming inconvenient. I protected you from making a childish mistake. I stared at him. A childish mistake? New York was unstable. Competitive. You were emotional back then. You would have struggled. His voice grew sharper with each sentence, more defensive. I offered you a real life, Evelyn. A family. Security. Everything we built together exists because I made practical decisions when you could not. I felt strangely calm listening to him. Not because his words hurt less. Because they finally explained too much. You decided my future without asking me. Thomas scoffed quietly. And look around. Was I wrong? I looked slowly around the office he loved so much. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. Awards. Photographs from corporate galas where I stood smiling beside him like carefully arranged decoration. A beautiful life from the outside. A vanished one underneath it. Yes, I said softly. You were. Thomas stared at me in disbelief, almost offended by the idea that I might disagree with him after all these years. Do not rewrite history now because some billionaire suddenly remembered your college hobby. College hobby. The words landed harder than shouting would have. I folded my hands carefully in front of me because I refused to let him see them shaking. It was never a hobby. Thomas drank from his glass impatiently. This is exactly why I handled things back then. You get carried away emotionally. I almost laughed then. Not because anything felt funny. Because I finally understood the pattern clearly enough to see how often he had rewritten my reality until even I doubted myself. Every dream became impractical. Every opinion became emotional. Every sacrifice became natural. Charles told me something today, I said quietly. Thomas rolled his eyes slightly. I am sure he did. I held his gaze steadily for the first time in years. He said you spent 40 years erasing me. Something flickered across Thomas's face then. Not guilt. Fear. Thomas did not sleep in our bedroom that night. Around midnight, I heard the door to his office close downstairs, followed by the low murmur of financial news drifting faintly through the vents. For years that would have upset me. I would have followed him downstairs, apologized for creating tension, and convinced myself preserving peace mattered more than preserving dignity. But something inside me had shifted too far to return to that version of myself anymore. I stayed awake beside the dark bedroom window watching headlights pass quietly along the street outside while memories continued rearranging themselves into new meaning. The next morning arrived cold and bright after days of rain. I made coffee out of habit and stood barefoot in the kitchen while sunlight stretched across the marble countertops. For the first time in decades, the silence inside the house no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Lunch today? Just us?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying yes. Amanda chose a restaurant overlooking Lake Michigan where women in tailored coats discussed vacations in Napa and private schools while waiters carried overpriced salads between polished white tables. She arrived 10 minutes early wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that looked carefully neutral. "Thank you for meeting me," she said after sitting down. I folded my napkin quietly onto my lap. "You sounded concerned." Amanda hesitated before answering. "Thomas called Ethan last night." "Of course he did. And?" "He said Charles Whittaker is manipulating you." I almost smiled at that. The irony felt almost elegant. Amanda lowered her voice slightly. "Ethan and I did not know about the music school. Or New York. Most people did not." She studied me carefully across the table. "Did you really give all of that up for Thomas?" I looked out the window toward the lake shimmering pale blue beneath the winter sun. At the time, I believed marriage meant building one life together. And now? I thought about the hidden acceptance letter. The years spent becoming quieter. Smaller. Easier to manage. Now I think sometimes women disappear so slowly nobody notices until decades later. Amanda looked genuinely unsettled by that answer. For several minutes we ate in silence before she finally spoke again. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Yes." "Why did you stay?" The question lingered heavily between us because I realized I had never truly asked myself that directly before. "At first because I loved him," I answered quietly. "Then because Ethan needed stability. Then because leaving after 20 years felt impossible. After 40 years, I gave a faint sad smile. You stop remembering where else you were supposed to go." Amanda looked down at her untouched iced tea. "I think Ethan is starting to see things differently." "Good." She looked back up at me carefully. "Thomas is scared." That surprised me enough to hold my attention fully. "Scared of what?" Amanda hesitated. "Of losing control." The words landed softly because they were true. I thought back to the expression on Thomas's face the previous evening when I finally disagreed with him openly. Not anger first. Fear. As though my silence had always been part of the foundation beneath his confidence. Before I could respond, movement near the restaurant entrance caught Amanda's attention. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh my God." I turned instinctively and saw two women in expensive coats entering together while whispering urgently to each other. Both belonged to the same charity circle Amanda socialized with regularly. One of them recognized me immediately. Her expression changed with startling speed. Surprise first. Then curiosity. Then something almost respectful. "Evelyn Hayes," she said warmly while approaching our table. "I heard you had lunch with Charles Whittaker yesterday." There it was. The shift. Small. Subtle. But unmistakable. Yesterday I had been invisible. Today people suddenly remembered my full name. "Charles spoke very highly of your compositions at the conservatory board meeting this morning," the woman continued. "I had no idea you were involved in music professionally." Professionally. The word almost hurt. Amanda sat completely still beside me watching the interaction unfold. "It was a long time ago," I replied politely. Still, the woman smiled. "Charles apparently believes your work deserves renewed attention." After they finally walked away, Amanda stared at me across the table with an expression I had never seen directed toward me before. Not pity. Not obligation. Respect. Do you realize what is happening? She asked quietly. I folded my hands together calmly. Not entirely. Amanda exhaled slowly. People in this city worship Charles Whittaker. If he publicly supports you, she stopped herself halfway through the sentence. She did not need to finish it. We both understood already. By the time I returned home that afternoon, Thomas was waiting in the living room still wearing his office clothes despite it only being 4:30. Where were you? He asked immediately. Lunch. With Whittaker? No. Amanda. Relief crossed his face briefly before suspicion replaced it again. Charles called the office today. My pulse shifted slightly. Why? Thomas stared at me for a long moment before answering. He invited us to dinner Friday night. Silence settled between us. Then Thomas added quietly, almost reluctantly, apparently the invitation is specifically for you. Friday evening arrived colder than expected. Thin snow drifted lightly across North Shore while the city skyline glowed silver in the distance. Beyond the lake. Thomas spent nearly an hour choosing a tie before dinner, though he pretended otherwise. I watched him from the bedroom mirror while fastening the pearl bracelet my mother once gave me. The same bracelet I wore the night Charles recognized me at the gala. You should wear the black dress, Thomas said while adjusting his cuffs. It looks more formal. I glanced toward the navy blue gown hanging beside the closet door instead. I prefer this one. He opened his mouth as if preparing to argue, then stopped himself. That alone told me everything about how much had already changed between us. The Whittaker residence overlooked the lake from a quiet street lined with old trees wrapped in white lights for winter. The house itself did not look flashy the way wealthy homes often do. It looked timeless. Warm light spilled from tall windows onto the snow while soft piano music drifted faintly through hidden speakers near the entrance hall. A woman in an elegant dark green dress greeted us at the door with a smile. Mrs. Hayes, she said warmly to me before even acknowledging Thomas. Charles is waiting for you in the music room. Thomas stiffened almost invisibly beside me. The music room sat at the back of the house overlooking the frozen shoreline beyond enormous windows. Shelves filled with original scores and leather-bound books lined the walls while a black Steinway grand piano rested beneath a chandelier casting soft gold light across the room. Charles stood beside the piano speaking quietly with two older members of the conservatory board. The moment he saw me, his entire expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me remember what it felt like to be welcomed instead of managed. Evelyn, he said softly. You look beautiful. Thomas cleared his throat beside me. Charles. But Charles barely glanced at him. Dinner itself felt surreal from beginning to end. Conversations revolved around music, literature, philanthropy, and university programs instead of stock markets and acquisition strategies. For the first time in decades, I spoke during a dinner without someone interrupting or redirecting me halfway through a sentence. And each time I hesitated, Charles listened carefully as though my thoughts still carried value. At one point, one of the board members turned toward me with visible curiosity. Charles tells us your compositions were remarkable. I almost dismissed the compliment automatically out of habit. Then I noticed Thomas watching me closely across the table. Waiting. Measuring. I loved writing music, I answered quietly. Very much. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. You still do. Something about the certainty in his voice settled deep inside my chest. After dinner, Charles invited everyone into the music room for coffee and dessert. Snow continued falling softly outside while the fire crackled low beside the piano. There is something I would like to show everyone, Charles said calmly before crossing toward the Steinway. He opened a folder resting on the piano bench and lifted several pages carefully into his hands. My breath caught immediately. My compositions. Restored. Professionally bound. These pieces were written by Evelyn Hayes during her final year at Northwestern, Charles explained to the room. Last month, our conservatory faculty reviewed them anonymously during an archive restoration project. Thomas shifted uncomfortably beside the fireplace. Charles continued speaking without looking at him. 3 professors independently described the work as exceptional. Silence spread slowly across the room. One of the women near the window looked stunned. These were hers? Charles nodded once. Yes. And next spring, the Whitaker Conservatory will perform her original compositions publicly for the first time. I stared at him in complete shock. Charles, you deserve to hear your music live, he said gently. At least once in your life. Across the room, Thomas looked pale beneath the warm light of the fireplace. For years he controlled every narrative inside our marriage. Tonight that control was quietly dissolving in front of people whose opinions mattered deeply to him. Ethan arrived late because of work, but the moment he entered the music room and saw my compositions spread across the piano, confusion washed visibly across his face. Mom wrote those, he asked softly. Your mother was extraordinary, Charles answered before anyone else could speak. Ethan looked toward me slowly then, and for the first time since he was a little boy, I saw uncertainty in his understanding of our family. Not pity. Not embarrassment. Realization. Much later, after dessert plates had been cleared away and guests began gathering coats near the entrance hall, I stepped quietly onto the back terrace overlooking the snowy lake. Cold air wrapped around me instantly while soft light from inside glowed against the snow behind me. A moment later, Charles joined me outside carrying 2 cups of tea. You disappeared, he said softly. I smiled faintly. I needed a moment. He handed me one of the cups carefully. How are you feeling? I looked out toward the dark frozen shoreline stretching endlessly beneath the night sky. For years I would have answered automatically. Fine. Tired. Busy. Practical words for a carefully reduced life. But tonight something inside me felt different. Lighter somehow. I think, I said slowly, I finally remember who I was before I became someone else's shadow. Charles stood beside me quietly for a long moment. Then he smiled gently into the winter air and said the one thing nobody had ever told me during my entire marriage. Evelyn Hayes was never meant to disappear.